April Smith always loved her grandmother, and therefore her passing left a deep wound in the woman's soul. How am I supposed to live all alone now? Who will wait for me at home and greet me at the door? Who will pat me on the head and support me with a kind word? She kept thinking with tears in her eyes. April still remembered all the time they spent with her grandmother in the kitchen, baking delicious pies with apple and cherry jam. "Don't put too much jam in, honey. Watch how I do it," the old woman used to say with a smile, using a teaspoon to get just the right amount of jam out of the jar. Charlotte Smith raised her granddaughter from an early age, and she was definitely April's closest person in the whole wide world. Unfortunately, April's parents died when their daughter was barely 6 years old. An accident on the road left the little girl without parents, and if it weren't for her grandmother, Charlotte, she would have certainly ended up at an orphanage. But she didn't, because Charlotte Smith took her granddaughter in and replaced both of her parents in the life of the little girl. Charlotte used to work as a teacher. She devoted almost 40 years of her life to this job. In addition to her deceased daughter, Charlotte Smith also had a son, who barely ever came to visit his mother. Darren Smith was April's uncle, but the girl never saw him as such, because frankly, she didn't really like him. Firstly, Darren barely ever came to visit his mother, and when he did, it was only to borrow money from her, which he never once paid her back. Secondly, he never got along with his sister, even back when they were little, which was why he disliked his niece from the very moment they first met. Darren never gave April any presents for her birthdays and treated her like she wasn't even part of the family. Of course, Charlotte tried to reason with her son and remind him that despite his history with her mother, April was still his niece. But Darren only cared about his own well-being and tried to arrange a comfortable life for himself by any means necessary. Maybe if Mrs. Smith's son didn't have a gambling problem, his dream would have come true sooner or later, but he did, and thus he spent all of his money on poker, digging himself deep into a lone hole. Time flew by, rushing through the sheets of the tear-off calendar. April grew up and started college. The young woman majored in economics and was planning on going into business. By this time, Charlotte Smith had already developed serious health problems, which were mainly caused by the hardships and deprivations that accompanied her throughout her life. Of course, this couldn't but worry the young woman, for whom her grandmother was the only close person in the whole world. Despite the fact that his mother's health was deteriorating rapidly, Darren believed that it didn't concern him. Mrs. Smith couldn't give him any more money for his poker games, which was all that the man really cared about. By that time, the amount of his debt reached cosmic proportions, and so he needed more and more money to pay it off. Like any caring mother, Mrs. Smith could feel that her son was having problems and tried to help him from time to time. Most of the time, she simply transferred money to Darren's bank account, which made his life much easier. Over time, the selfish young man got so insolent that he stopped visiting his old mother altogether and reduced all communication to rare phone calls or text messages. April understood that such an attitude towards the elderly woman was simply unbearable, but she couldn't change the situation. Darren was only interested in money and didn't care about anything else. When Charlotte got very sick, her son didn't even bother to call her or inquire about her health, let alone come for a visit. All this time, April took care of her beloved grandmother, making sure that she didn't feel lonely or abandoned. When Mrs. Smith's health deteriorated so much that she stopped getting out of bed, the young woman realized that her grandmother had days, maybe even hours, left to live. Picking up the phone with tears in her eyes, she tried calling Darren, but as luck would have it, he didn't pick up. Fortunately, fate took pity on the unfortunate Charlotte Smith, and the woman never got to find out that at that very moment, when she needed her son the most, he was on a drinking binge after yet another major loss. When the old woman died, April was the one to take care of all of the funeral arrangements. The poor woman had already buried her relatives twice. The worst part for the young woman was that her deadbeat uncle didn't even bother coming to his own mother's funeral, which once again proved what a terrible person he was. That's too much, even for him. How could one be so awful to miss their own mother's funeral? April thought, standing at her grandmother's grave. Fortunately, Mrs. Smith's former student, whom she taught back in high school, was the only one to help April with all of the funeral arrangements. Despite the fact that Liam Johnson now worked in law enforcement, he used to be a bully and a daredevil back in school. His father was doing time in State County Jail, and most of the teachers believed that the same kind of fate awaited Liam soon. It was only Charlotte Smith who saw something in the boy that others didn't notice and made every effort to ensure that he didn't follow in his father's footsteps. Mrs. Smith gave Liam individual lessons and did everything that she could to instill love for studying in him, thus preventing him from living a life of crime in the future. Thanks to Mrs. Smith's efforts, Liam graduated from school with decent grades and managed to get a job with the police force. Upon learning of the death of Charlotte Smith, the young man immediately volunteered to help with the funeral arrangements, which the devastated April truly appreciated. "Thank you, Liam. I don't know if I could have done it without you. Thank you so much for all your help," the young woman said, dabbing her eyes with the handkerchief. "Don't even mention it. Mrs. Smith did so much for me that I still feel like I owe her," the police officer replied. The young people stood by the grave of April's grandmother for a little longer and went home. They were the last two people to leave the cemetery. April always considered herself a selfless and honest person, and therefore she never even thought about if her late grandmother left a will or not. The young woman wasn't worried about the old woman's savings, even though her grandmother had been putting away money her entire life. After her grandmother's death, April continued to live in her house and pay the bills. Darren Smith hadn't been to the old woman's house for the longest time, and he didn't even come to the funeral. Having chosen to forgive her uncle for such unseemly behavior, April decided to move on and not waste her time on this unpleasant man. Imagine the young woman's surprise when Darren Smith showed up to her grandmother's house about a month after the funeral. He didn't call in advance or anything, but simply came knocking boldly and unceremoniously on April's door one early September morning. Confused about who it could be, April opened the door without a second thought and gasped in surprise. "Uncle Darren? Is that you?" "It's me, as you can see, but what are you doing here?" the guest muttered, sounding annoyed. "What do you mean, I live here?" the young woman muttered timidly. Ignoring April's answer, Darren went into the house like he owned the place and started inspecting the rooms. He took a measuring tape out of his pocket once in a while and measured the windows, walls, and doorways for some reason. "What are you doing?" April asked cautiously. Darren gave her a contemptuous look and then hissed through his teeth. "Can't you see? I'm getting the house ready for sale." "What, do you have any objections?" April almost choked with indignation at his words. "Are you out of your mind? Are you going to sell your dead mother's house? And what about me? I need a place to live. And where were you all those years when your mother needed your help and support?" Darren turned purple with anger and came close to April before saying, "Who are you to talk about my mother, you vile gold digger? You have no rights in this house, and you have no right to interfere in the affairs of my family. This house belongs to me and no one else." It was only then that April realized what a mean and horrible man Darren Smith truly was. They'd barely just buried his mother, and there he was, rushing to get his hands on her money and property as soon as possible. And that was despite the fact that they didn't even know whether Charlotte had left a will or not. "So you have 2 days to get out of this house. Rent your own place, buy your own place, I don't care. Just make sure you're out of here in 2 days," Darren growled. April's eyes filled with tears. The poor young woman simply didn't know what to say in the face of such injustice. Darren was so insolent and mean, as if he were talking to some homeless person begging for alms at the supermarket, not his own niece. Having announced his intention to sell the house, he finally lost all respect in the eyes of the young woman who wanted to honor the memory of her late grandmother. After Darren left, April covered her face with her hands and cried. The young woman was deeply hurt by the fact that her uncle wanted to throw her out of the house like an unwanted dog who displeased its master. Trying to find a way out of the situation, April called Liam and told him everything. Having listened to the young woman's problem, the police officer got to thinking. Liam knew that Darren was in the wrong, but he needed better arguments than just his take on the matter. "Please don't worry, I will definitely figure something out. He's not getting this house," Liam answered, clenching his fists. The police officer decided to start by running a background check on the late Charlotte's son. Liam understood that Darren's desire to sell the house so quickly could only mean one thing. He was having some serious financial problems. As it turned out later, Liam was right about it. After losing a large amount of money to some serious people from Latin America, Darren decided to use his late mother's house to pay them back. The only problem with his plan was his niece, April. So Darren decided to simply scare the young woman and pressure her into vacating the house. However, Mrs. Smith's low life of a son didn't take one thing into account. His mother had many friends who cared about her and her granddaughter. Having asked Darren to come in for a chat at the police station, Liam took the time to describe in great detail what would happen if the unlucky gambler were to use his mother's house to pay off his debt. As the main argument, Liam used the will of the late Mrs. Smith, which the family lawyer had all this time. According to her will, Charlotte left all of her assets to her niece, April, while Darren got nothing. Needless to say, Darren was beyond shocked when he heard Liam read out Charlotte's will. Having realized his defeat, Darren lowered his head and left the police station without even saying goodbye. The first thing Liam did after that was call April and tell her that she didn't need to worry anymore. Having heard the good news, April mentally thanked her late grandmother, who didn't stop taking care of her even after her death. Looking up at the sky, the young woman was sure that Charlotte Smith was looking down at her, smiling and wishing her nothing but happiness.